A number of you asked one of the most difficult questions that can be asked, namely, why does God permit suffering in this world? And I wanted to deal with that right now, since so many of you asked it, and you anticipate that you're going to be asked this question as a teacher, and of course you will. It's a great question, and because of its importance and its great weight, I wanted to deal with this from the get-go. I also wanted to do this on video. And I think I'll record a commentary on the work you did this week. Your essays telling the story of how you got here. Those were really inspiring in many ways. And they gave rise to a lot of thoughts that I would like to share with you next week. And I'll do that on video as well. But there's no simple answer to this question about the mystery of suffering. There is an answer, of course, but suffering is a mystery, and it's a mystery that's too large for one answer. Basically, you could say that the entire Bible, all the way through the New Testament, to Christ's death on the cross, is really an answer to this mystery. I'm going to attempt to deal with it at this point, and let me just say at the beginning that mystery in theology does not mean the same thing as it does in literature, for example. A mystery, as it's used in the world today, is typically a problem that has yet to be solved. One of my favorite shows was Unsolved Mysteries. It was a great show. But mystery, as it's used in that context, denotes a problem that in principle can be solved, but has not yet been solved. In theology, a mystery is not that. Rather, a mystery is something that is inexhaustible and infinitely knowable. God is the mystery par excellence. Even when we see God face to face in the beatific vision, we will still not comprehend God. We will know him directly, but God is infinitely knowable. He can never be fully comprehended. The Trinity, of course, is the central mystery of our faith. It cannot be fully understood, even though it's somewhat intelligible to us. An individual human person is a mystery in this sense. And the reason is that each person has been created in the image and likeness of God. A personality test, for example, like the Myers-Briggs or any other test, can tell us a great deal about ourselves. But you are always more than what can be understood through a rigorous personality test. There's a sense in which you too, therefore, are infinitely knowable. Each one of us is limited without a doubt. But we don't even understand ourselves completely. We are a mystery unto ourselves. And the more we enter into the heart of God through prayer, the more we discover who we are in his eyes. But we never entirely figure ourselves out, because our origin is in God. And so the more we know our origin, the more we know ourselves. But our origin is God, who is an inexhaustible reservoir, so to speak. And so there's no end to coming to understand ourselves. In any case, let's get back to the mystery of suffering, because it's a mystery in the theological sense. So what I say here does not exhaust the mystery, although I hope to shed some light on it. But I've seen a lot of suffering over the years. And as a deacon who ministers to those who suffer from mental illness, I've seen quite a bit since 2008, which I would otherwise have missed. And a number of my patients over the years have asked me, why does God allow this suffering in my life? And the most honest answer I can give is ultimately, I don't know. And I'd be a fool to attempt an answer that seeks to explain why God has allowed suffering in your life at this time, or a specific suffering in the past. I don't know the mind of God, and it would be arrogance for me to offer an explanation. Unfortunately, some people do put forth an explanation, and often their explanations do more harm than good. Some of you mentioned this pandemic, and I'll address a few things that I was up against last March. But, you know, although I can't answer the question on an individual level, that is, why does God allow this suffering in this person's life? Why has he allowed me to suffer from schizophrenia, for example, or clinical depression, or a serious trauma like witnessing my mother's suicide? Um, although I can't answer that question on an individual level, I can offer something on a very general level that might help others who find themselves questioning this. I'm going to try to address this again on a very general level, but from a few angles. But first, let's look at this from a more philosophical angle rather than theological. We'll come back to the theology later. But it can be demonstrated through pure reason alone that God exists. We won't get into this at this point, but it can be shown through reason that God is that being whose nature is to be. He is pure act of existing. And this means that God cannot not exist. He necessarily exists. Leibniz, one of the inventors of calculus, he offers the shortest proof of God's existence. He refers to God as the necessary being who always existed. And he says, if the necessary being is possible, then the necessary being exists. That's it. That's his proof. It's a fascinating proof that, I've studied this from many angles and it's flawless from a logical point of view, but I won't get into it now. But if you were to think about it, it might just click into place as it does for some people. It's like looking at a stereogram image. After a while, the image in it emerges. So if the necessary being is possible, then the necessary being exists. Why? Because it's the necessary being, and the necessary being cannot not exist. In any case, God is that being who always existed, who is absolutely first, uncreated, the source of all that exists. So let's make that our starting point. Well, consider the following deductive inferences. If God is all powerful, then God can do whatever he wants. Now, if God is supremely good, the supreme good, then it follows that God wills your greatest happiness. Now, if God is all powerful, but not supremely good, then he has the power to bring about your greatest happiness, but he doesn't necessarily will your greatest happiness because he is not supremely good. On the other hand, if God is supremely good, but not all powerful, then he wills your greatest happiness, but he's unable to bring it about because he's not all powerful. Those of you who are parents, you have kids, this experience. We want the best for our kids, but we're powerless to guarantee it. We know from within our own limitations. But here's the crux of the matter. If God is all powerful, he has complete dominion over being. He creates out of nothing. And so nothing limits his power, for there is nothing outside of being. Furthermore, good is a property of being. And so if God is pure being itself, without beginning and without end, then God is the supreme good, the origin of all that is good. Now you put those two premises together and one conclusion necessarily follows. He wills your greatest happiness and he has the power to bring it about. It follows necessarily that whatever God chooses to permit in your life and in my life, he permits it ultimately for our greatest happiness. That follows necessarily and logically. The problem is that it's very abstract. When we're in the midst of suffering, it's very difficult to see how this suffering can eventually lead to my greatest happiness. That requires an act of pure faith. However, I have seen a lot in my life, 32 years in schools and especially these past 12 years in serving those with mental illness. And I will say this about human beings. This I am certain of. Human beings are at their worst in times of prosperity, but we are at our best in times of suffering. And, this is true of nations as well. If you study the history of the 20th century, you'll see that during times of economic prosperity, we became rather arrogant, and human beings were cocky and independent and avaricious and racist and bigoted. But then World War I breaks out and human beings are plunged into suffering and turmoil. But it's at this time that the best was brought out of us. We became more humane. Difficult times produce heroes. And that period then again is followed by prosperity, which again brings out the worst in us, followed by another war, followed by heroism, followed by economic prosperity, and then moral depravity again. The history of Israel is just like that as well. If you read the entire Bible, during times of prosperity, Israel falls away from fidelity to the Torah. And then they are overrun by their enemies, they're oppressed, but they repent and return to God who delivers them, and they prosper once again. But then they drift away from fidelity to the Torah. The prophets call Israel back. They ignore them. Their enemies, the enemies of Israel, like the Babylonians or the Assyrians, attack and drag them off into exile. And then Israel is plunged into darkness and suffering and repents and returns to God. And of course, it's during these dark times that the great biblical literature arises, And so we tend to be like that as well in our own individual lives. Now, each individual human life is different, And again, let me say from the start that many great saints suffered from mental illness, including clinical depression, Clinical depression is not a result of moral failure. It's neurological. And I've been in the presence of some patients who are suffering from horrible depression. And, I've said to myself, if I were in their shoes, I don't think I could do it. I don't have that courage. And so I would never judge the heart of anyone who has committed suicide. In fact, I've had a couple of students over the past 3 decades who have committed suicide. And a few of my patients that I knew also committed suicide. And I'm convinced that they're surrounded by the love and mercy of God at this point. A person's freedom is severely mitigated by such depression. But there are some patients that I came to know well. And one in particular suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. I've had a number of them who have, which really is a horrible illness. And, you feel like there's somebody after you all the time. What was interesting, this person had a very devoted prayer life. And there were moments when he experienced tremendous joy in prayer, a tremendous sense of the presence of God. And this was the case with a lot of the patients that I came to know over the years. But as I got to know this person's life before the illness hit, I began to realize something. And of course, I would never say this to him, and I never did say this. But as I listened to him tell me about his life before schizophrenia, I realized this. He really was leading a life of moral depravity, of arrogance, vanity, narcissism, sexual promiscuity, lying, theft. And then something happened which acted as a stressor, which triggered the paranoid schizophrenia. And I realized that this illness is probably one of his greatest gifts. I would not say that it was sent by God. That would be too simple. God does not will evil. But I came to believe this. God permitted this illness in his life, and doing so really was a gift. Because had he not been ill, he would easily have been a lost soul. No doubt about it. but it was his illness that caused him to reach out to God in the darkness of his illness and to call out to him. And of course, when we call, he answers. And this person is not a lost soul, although he still struggles with paranoid schizophrenia. Um, and yet this life is short. We are only passing through. We were created by God and we were created for God. We came from God and our destiny is to return to him. And this life is really a preparation for eternal life. But many people treat this life as if this is it. This is all there is. And we're as if we're not going to die, and our moral character really doesn't matter. And that's why the remembrance of death is a very healthy thing, both spiritually and psychologically. The last school that I was at in Markham on the second floor, just at the top of the stairs outside the chapel, there's a wall with all the pictures of those students who died while they were students. And I always thought that was such a good idea, It was a constant reminder to students that life is short, that their life is short. But I've always told my students that looking back, it's clear now that my greatest disappointments always turned out to be my greatest blessings. It wasn't possible to see that at the time, but, years later, looking back, I can see it. The mystery of our own individual suffering is so much tied up in the mystery of our own individual selves. And it's really only by entering into the heart of God through prayer that the mystery of our own life begins to open up. A theologically flawed view is that suffering is a punishment from God. And I was battling this at the beginning of the pandemic. One person I knew was announcing that this pandemic is a chastisement from God. And since the beginning of this pandemic, I've maintained that the idea of a divine chastisement is a very dangerous position to take. The fact of the matter is we simply don't know the mind of God, especially with respect to this particular pandemic. He has not revealed it. There's no doubt that sin causes great suffering, but it doesn't follow that all suffering is caused by sin. We can just think of a basic syllogism. If I consume too much scotch, I will feel euphoric. That's true. I feel euphoric. Therefore, I must have been drinking. Well, that's faulty reasoning. Identical reasoning occurs with suffering. If we sin, we will suffer in some way because sin destroys us. You are suffering. Therefore, you must have sinned. No, that's bad logic. And, what Jesus made clear is that it's not necessarily the case that all hardship is to be explained by an individual's sin or the sins of ancestors. In the Gospel of John, for example, in chapter 9, he saw a blind man from birth. And let me just read this. As he passed by, Jesus saw a blind man from his birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be made manifest in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night comes when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. As he said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and anointed the man's eyes with the clay, saying to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. And so he went and washed and came back seeing. Very important text. There's no doubt that God can and does draw good out of evil. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see tremendous good arise out of this particular period of difficulty, this pandemic. But in light of the revelation of the divine mercy, which is inexhaustible, that is, in light of the fact that God entered into human suffering by joining a human nature to himself in view of Good Friday, also that we might find him in the midst of our own suffering and dying. A far more plausible account of the crisis that we are in is that this is not a chastisement at all, but it's a product of natural evolution out of which God can and will draw tremendous good. We can be certain of this last point because, as St. Paul says in his letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 28, I believe, we know that all things work for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. So to definitively conclude anything more than this is really an unwarranted leap. And, to confidently proclaim that this is a chastisement from God is really epistemically presumptuous, if not downright arrogant. However, although it is just not the case that if one is suffering, there must be some sin at the root of it, it is nevertheless true that sin and self-seeking causes tremendous suffering. People do make choices, and the choices that they make often cause tremendous suffering, especially in their own families. I'm thinking of a person who is unfaithful, for example, the suffering that causes, and the hurt in turn causes more suffering, just like the ripple effect in a pond. The late Canadian psychiatrist, Dr. Murray McGovern, made this point to my good friend, a priest from a nearby diocese. Dr. McGovern was responsible for evaluating candidates for the priesthood for the Hamilton Diocese, and he did an extensive psychological evaluation on this friend of mine, and when he was going through the priesthood, going through the seminary. And he told me what Dr. McGovern said to him, which he never forgot. As part of the battery of tests that the candidate has to go through, he would show my friend pictures that he had to interpret by making up a story and rendering the scenes meaningful. He'd be given a picture of three men, for example, sitting around a fire by the railway track and drinking, for example, or a woman looking out her window, very sad. And, what my friend wrote or made up were, stories that depicted them as victims of a cruel environment, like the Great Depression or an unjust employer who fired them or something, or in the case of the sad woman, a cold and unloving husband. Well, Dr. McGovern called my friend's attention to this afterwards, and he said something to the effect that, there's a lot of victims in your world, maybe they got fired from their place of employment because of something they did, or some choice they made, how come you didn't throw something like that into your story? And he warned them to keep in mind that many of the situations that people find themselves in are the result of bad personal choices made in the past. And that if my friend fails to uh, keep this in mind, it's going to lead to serious problems down the road. He told my friend that excessively empathetic priests, even social workers, and excessively empathetic teachers tend to be vulnerable to being manipulated and deceived. And Dr. McGovern actually said, he was a devout Catholic, and he said that the artful schemes of evil, that they'll be blind to the you'll be vulnerable to the artful schemes of evil and blind to the preternatural malice of Satan, because such people readily believe that everyone is good-willed, and they're dangerously unsuspecting. And after many years in the priesthood, I've reminded my friend of Dr. McGovern's warning, which he at times did not pay heed to, at least not enough, because my friend has been taken advantage of many times over the years, and he's paid dearly for it. People make choices. Evil is real, and such choices cause great suffering, which is why there is so much suffering in this world. We live in a sinful world in which people choose to govern their own lives by doing their own will rather than God's will. And the problem, however, is that inevitably the innocent suffer as a result. And there is innocent suffering. especially the suffering of children, which takes me to another angle to this question of the mystery of suffering. There's one pain that I hope I never have to experience, and that's the experience of a parent burying her child. No parent should have to attend the funeral of their child. It should be the other way around, but it often is not the case. My mother had to bury my brother, who died when I was 32 and he was 42, and I was a young teacher. But I offer this reflection for those who harbor anger against God for a loss of some kind, like the loss of a child. Imagine a very wealthy person suddenly entering your life and telling you that $100,000 is going to be automatically deposited into your bank account every month for an as yet undetermined period of time. You don't know when, but one day the cash flow will stop. It may stop after a year, or it may continue for a decade or two. If it continues, you'll have received $1 million within a year. Why do I bring this up? Well, we know from the book of Exodus that God is He who is, in Hebrew, Yahweh. And on the basis of this text, Aquinas argues that God is his own act of existing, whereas the rest of us in creation have only a received act of existing. God's nature is to exist. As such, God is the first existential cause of everything that is, whether it be a thought, a meson, a photon of light, a human person, or even an angel. Now, over the years, I've met some young people who have lost loved ones very close to them. And some of these people responded to their loss by drawing closer to God, while others became angry with God and consequently cut themselves off from the sacraments. And I have no intention of judging these latter people, but I do offer a thought, and here's the thought. A person cannot be in debt if the creditor does not exist. In other words, basically, God cannot incur debt. Existence is sheer gift. It's not possible to earn the right to exist. If one doesn't exist, one cannot earn anything. And everything we have from God is pure gift, given gratis, without our having earned any of it, not even the slightest moment of time. If God chooses to give my sister only 5 years, I cannot justifiably claim that God owes her more, any more than I can demand that the $100,000 that I've been receiving monthly be continued for another 10 years or so, or any more than I can demand 30 million instead of 15 million. That money was given gratis. It was all bonus. It belongs to someone who has chosen to share it with me without my having any right to it. I do not have a claim on the source. Similarly, my life doesn't belong to me, but belongs to God. Should I or my sister or my brother or my daughter, be called home after 25 years or 15 years or even 5 years, no one can accuse God of depriving me or her or him of what is rightfully mine, hers, or his. Because everything was bonus from the start. And the same is true for my child. My daughter has been entrusted to me, not for my sake, but for hers. For she is not my right. She is a trust. A human being cannot be made the object of a right. A child is a gift, the supreme gift of matrimony. To make, a child the object of a right is to really violate the requirement that other human persons be treated in a way that respects their status as equal in dignity to myself. And so it's on the basis of this trust that I am bound by duty, but not God. My life has been entrusted to me, and so my own body is not, properly speaking, my own. It's on the basis of this trust that I am bound by duty to protect my life, to revere it, and to preserve it. But God is not bound by duty. Um, Everything I have in life is bonus, pure gift, sheer gift. And so I contend that the reason so many people are not as nearly as happy as they could be is that they go through life without the explicit awareness that everything in their lives is pure gift. There's something wrong with the way they see things. Most people have not learned joy because their vision is darkened by a confusion between what is gift and what is a debt. But really, each day is a gift. Our very life in the flesh is gift. Our friends are gift. Education is gift. Intelligence is gift. And parents are gift. There's a sense in which, every day is our birthday, and, just look around and try to find one thing that isn't gift. Finally, final point. The most profound and most convincing way to deal with this mystery is theologically. And so this requires faith in the person of Christ. But the central mystery of the Christian faith is really the incarnation of the Son of God. Christ revealed God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Not three gods, but one God. But mysteriously, God is three real distinct persons. We'll get into this later. This is a mystery. This, again, the central mystery of the faith, the incarnation of the Trinity. But it was God the Son who joined a human nature to himself, and in so doing, made his dwelling among us, as it says in the prologue of the Gospel of John. God the Son entered into history in the flesh. More to the point, he entered into human suffering. He came to join us in our suffering, to unite human suffering to his divine life. And of course, the ultimate goal of his coming among us was Good Friday, his death on the cross, through which the human race is reconciled to God. God the Son, who was life itself, allowed himself to be swallowed up by death. And so now we can find him in our suffering. God the Son is there in the depths of human darkness, and he is there in death as well. Christ tasted human suffering, and it was his suffering that preceded his resurrection. All suffering can now be a means to resurrected life, if we so choose to meet him in the depths of our own suffering. Suffering now becomes a means of conforming to the image of Christ. We become like him. Friendships are always based on common qualities, common interests. When you meet someone, with whom you have something in common, usually a friendship is created. There's nothing in common, it's hard to establish a friendship. But those who suffer innocently have something in common with Christ. They are alike. There's a conformity there, a likeness. That, I believe, is why so many of the patients that I've encountered over the years, those who suffer from mental illness, have achieved tremendous heights in terms of holiness. The first beatitude in the Gospel of Matthew: blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, which means blessed are those who are aware of their radical need for God. And it's the suffering above all who know this, and it's no coincidence that they are the most blessed, not in terms of wealth necessarily, but in terms of their depth of character and the depths of their faith. The kingdom of heaven is theirs, said Jesus. This is hard to explain, it's something to ponder over and to think about, those in our lives who have suffered very little, for example. They are often very superficial, you know. not much in terms of character. The the mystery of suffering. What I've said is certainly inadequate, but it's really the best I can do at this time. So I will stop there.